The crack of skin against skin echoed through the small farmhouse as Faith O'Connor crumpled to the floor, her golden hair falling across her face while her father loomed above her, his hand still raised for another strike. It was 1878 in the harsh territory of Arizona, and at 20 years old, Faith had just committed the unforgivable sin of refusing to marry the wealthy cattle baron who had offered her father 300 acres and a substantial sum for her hand. "You ungrateful child!" Thomas O'Connor roared, his face flushed with rage. "After everything we've done for you, this family needs this marriage, and by God you will obey." Faith's mother stood in the corner, her eyes downcast, saying nothing as her husband's boot connected with Faith's side. Her three brothers watched with varying degrees of discomfort, but none stepped forward to intervene. They knew as well as Faith did that the drought had nearly destroyed their ranch. The marriage would save them all. "I won't marry Mr. Jenkins," Faith gasped, struggling to her feet. At 55, Jenkins was older than her father, with small, cruel eyes that followed her every movement when he came to call. "He's a monster who's buried 3 wives already. You'll do as you're told." Her father grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully as he dragged her toward the door. "We're riding into town right now to tell him you've reconsidered. And when we return, you'll be properly grateful for your good fortune." The O'Connors emerged from their house as a unit, Faith stumbling as her father pulled her toward the wagon, her mother and brothers following silently behind. None of them noticed the lone rider observing from the ridge overlooking their property, nor the way his posture stiffened as he watched the scene unfold below. Clay Valance had been riding the territory for 3 days, tracking a notorious horse thief who had stolen his prized stallion. The commotion at the small ranch had drawn his attention as he passed by. At 25, Clay had seen his share of ugliness in the West, but something about the golden-haired woman's defiance against overwhelming odds struck a chord in him. When Faith's father slapped her again beside the wagon, causing her to fall to the dusty ground, Clay had seen enough. He spurred his borrowed mount forward, charging down the hillside in a cloud of dust. "What seems to be the trouble here?" Clay called out as he approached, his hand resting casually near the revolver at his hip. His voice was even, but his eyes were hard as steel as they took in the frightened young woman and the angry man standing over her. "This is family business, stranger," Thomas O'Connor snapped. "Ride on." Clay dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate. "Madam," he said, addressing Faith directly while ignoring her father, "are you in need of assistance?" Faith stared up at the stranger, taking in his worn leather vest, the faded blue shirt beneath it, and the confident set of his shoulders. His eyes were an unusual shade of green, clear and direct, without the hardness she'd come to expect from most men. "She's fine," her father barked before she could answer. "My daughter's just having a tantrum about her upcoming nuptials." "Didn't look like a tantrum to me," Clay said mildly, extending his hand to help Faith to her feet. "Looked more like a disagreement that got out of hand." Faith's hand trembled as she reached for his, feeling the surprising gentleness in his calloused grip. "I don't want to marry Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice stronger now that someone seemed willing to listen. "I've said no, but they won't hear it." Clay nodded once, never taking his eyes off her father. "A woman's entitled to choose her own husband, I reckon." Thomas O'Connor's face darkened. "This ain't your concern, Cowboy. I suggest you move along before things get unpleasant." Faith's brothers moved to flank their father, forming a solid wall of hostility. The oldest, Matthew, rested his hand on the rifle leaning against the wagon. "I've seen about as much unpleasantness as I care to already," Clay replied, his voice hardening. "No man has the right to strike a woman that way, especially not her father." "This is our land and that's our sister," Matthew said, stepping forward. "You best move on." Clay didn't move, his expression calm but resolute. "Madam," he said to Faith, "if you've a mind to leave, I'd be happy to escort you to town." Faith hesitated, feeling the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. But the thought of being sold to Jenkins like a prized heifer made her stomach turn. "You step away from my daughter right now," Thomas growled, advancing on Clay. What happened next occurred so quickly that Faith barely had time to register it. Her father lunged, Clay sidestepped, and suddenly her father was on the ground, with Clay's boot placed lightly but firmly on his chest. "I don't want trouble," Clay said calmly, "but I won't stand by and watch a woman beaten for speaking her mind." Faith's brothers moved to intercede, but Clay's hand on his revolver stopped them short. "Now, I'm going to ask the lady once more," he continued. "Madam, would you like to leave this situation?" In that moment, Faith saw her whole life stretching before her, years of submission, of being traded away to secure her family's future, of living with a man who viewed her as property. She looked at her mother's downcast eyes, at her brother's angry faces, at her father's rage, and she made her decision. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes, I want to leave." Clay nodded once, removed his foot from Thomas O'Connor's chest and backed toward his horse, keeping himself between Faith and her family. "This isn't over," Thomas snarled as he climbed to his feet. "She's promised to Jenkins. The papers are as good as signed." "A promise made under duress isn't binding," Clay replied evenly, helping Faith onto his horse before swinging up behind her. "And I imagine the sheriff might have something to say about the way you've been treating your daughter." Faith felt the solid warmth of Clay's chest against her back as he turned the horse. His arm came around her waist, not confining but supportive as he took up the reins. "You'll regret this," her father shouted after them. "Both of you." As Clay urged the horse into a trot, Faith felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of fear, of uncertainty about what she had just done and where she would go now. "Don't worry, madam," Clay said softly near her ear. "We'll get you somewhere safe. You have my word." Faith watched her family's ranch grow smaller in the distance, feeling as though she were waking from a nightmare into an uncertain dawn. She didn't know this man who had intervened on her behalf, didn't know where he was taking her or what would happen next, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirring of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Clay rode steadily westward, putting distance between them and the O'Connor ranch. The desert landscape stretched around them, vast and unforgiving, but Faith found comfort in the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the solid presence of the man behind her. "I'm Clay Valance," he finally said as they crested a ridge. "I apologize for the circumstances of our meeting, Miss Faith O'Connor," she replied, her voice steadier now. "And there's no need to apologize. You saved me." Clay nodded, scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of a man used to reading the land. "We're about 4 hours from Willow Creek. There's a respectable boarding house there where you can stay until you decide what you want to do." Faith twisted slightly to look at him. "Why did you help me?" "You don't know me." Clay was silent for a moment, considering. "I've seen too many people use their strength against those who can't fight back. I don't abide by it." He paused. "Besides, no one should be forced into marriage against their will." They rode in silence for a while, Faith lost in thought. Everything she owned was back at the ranch: her clothes, her mother's silver locket, the small collection of books she treasured. She had nothing but the dress she wore and the few coins tucked into her pocket. "I don't know how I'll pay for a boarding house," she admitted eventually. "I don't have much money." "Don't worry about that for now," Clay assured her. "Let's get you somewhere safe first. We can figure out the rest after." As they traveled, Faith learned that Clay was a horse trainer from Texas who had come to Arizona tracking a thief who'd stolen his prized stallion Midnight. He spoke little of himself, but when he did, his voice carried a quiet confidence that Faith found reassuring. When they stopped to rest the horse at a small stream, Clay offered Faith his canteen and a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. "I'm sorry I can't offer you more comfortable transportation," he said as she sipped the water. "I've been on the trail for 3 days." Faith shook her head. "You've done more than enough, more than anyone else ever has." She touched her cheek, which was beginning to swell from her father's blow. "My father wasn't always like that. The drought has been hard on everyone, and when our cattle started dying." She trailed off, not wanting to make excuses. Clay's eyes softened. "Hard times can change people, but that doesn't excuse cruelty." "No," Faith agreed. "It doesn't." When they resumed their journey, Faith found herself telling Clay about her life on the ranch, how her mother had taught her to read and write, how she dreamed of someday seeing the ocean, how the marriage to Jenkins had been arranged weeks ago without her knowledge or consent. "He's buried 3 wives already," she said quietly. "They say the last one fell down the stairs, but everyone knows what really happened." Clay's arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Then I'm especially glad I came along when I did." The sun was low on the horizon when they first saw Willow Creek in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings nestled along a meandering creek, lined with its namesake trees. Faith felt a curious mix of trepidation and excitement as they approached. She had never been further from home than the small trading post 10 miles from her family's ranch. "Mrs. Holloway runs the boarding house," Clay explained as they entered the town. "She's strict but fair, and she doesn't abide gossip." Faith nodded, suddenly conscious of how they must appear her with a bruised face, riding with a man who was not her husband or kin. The few people on the street turned to watch them pass, their faces curious. Mrs. Holloway proved to be a formidable woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took in Faith's condition with a single glance, and Clay's brief explanation with a firm nod. "I've no patience for men who beat women," she declared, showing Faith to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "You'll be safe here, Miss O'Connor." When Faith tried to explain about her lack of funds, Mrs. Holloway waved her off. "Mr. Valance has settled your account for 2 weeks. After that, we can discuss arrangements if needed." Faith turned to Clay in surprise. "You didn't have to do that," Clay shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "It's nothing. Just want to make sure you have time to get on your feet. Will you be staying in town?" Faith asked, surprised by how much she hoped the answer would be yes. "For a few days," Clay replied. "I've got business with the sheriff about that horse thief, and I should probably stick around in case your family comes looking for you." The thought sent a chill through Faith. "They will," she said quietly. "My father won't give up so easily." Clay's expression hardened. "Let me worry about that. You just rest and recover." That night, in the unfamiliar quiet of her rented room, Faith lay awake considering the extraordinary turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been trapped, facing a future she dreaded with no hope of escape. Now, against all odds, she was free at least temporarily. The memory of Clay's steady presence, of the way he had stood against her family without hesitation, brought a warmth to her chest she couldn't quite explain. She had never met a man like him before, one who seemed to believe that her wishes and choices mattered. As sleep finally claimed her, Faith's last conscious thought was that, for the first time in her life, she was truly the author of her own story, and she had no idea what the next page would bring. Clay spent the following morning with Sheriff Wilson, providing a detailed description of his stolen stallion and the man he suspected of taking it. The sheriff promised to send telegrams to neighboring towns and to keep an eye out, but Clay wasn't particularly hopeful. 3 days was a long head start in this territory. His business concluded, Clay found himself walking toward Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, telling himself he merely wanted to check on Faith's well-being. He found her in the small garden behind the house, helping Mrs. Holloway hang laundry on a line strung between two posts. The morning sunlight caught in Faith's golden hair, creating a halo effect that made Clay pause. Despite the bruise on her cheek, there was something lighter about her today, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She spotted him and smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Mr. Valance," she called, setting down her basket. "Mrs. Holloway has put me to work already." "Idle hands lead to idle thoughts," Mrs. Holloway sniffed, but there was kindness beneath her gruff exterior. "The girl needs purpose, not pity." Clay nodded, respecting the older woman's wisdom. "I just wanted to make sure you were settling in, Miss O'Connor." "Faith, please," she corrected him. "And I am. Mrs. Holloway has been very kind." "Nonsense," the older woman said. "Now, if you two want to talk, you can do it on the porch where it's proper, while I finish hanging these sheets." On the porch, Clay noticed that Faith had borrowed a dress from Mrs. Holloway. It was a bit large for her slender frame, but clean and neatly pinned. "I've been thinking about what to do next," Faith said after they had settled into the wooden rocking chairs. "Mrs. Holloway says the dressmaker in town needs an assistant. I'm good with a needle, so I thought I might inquire." Clay nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a fine idea." "What about you?" Faith asked. "How long will you stay in Willow Creek?" Before Clay could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the main street. Faith's breath caught as she recognized her brothers, Matthew and Luke, riding alongside another man she knew all too well, Harold Jenkins, her would-be husband. "They've found me," she whispered, instinctively shrinking back in her chair. Clay rose smoothly to his feet, positioning himself between Faith and the approaching men. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." Faith watched as Clay walked calmly down the porch steps to meet the 3 riders who had reined in their horses in front of the boarding house. Jenkins was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and small, calculating eyes. He wore an expensive suit despite the heat, a gold watch chain stretched across his ample belly. "There she is," Matthew called out, pointing to Faith on the porch. "Come on, Faith, time to go home." "The lady isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to," Clay replied evenly. Jenkins dismounted, his face flushed with anger or exertion or both. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. That's my fiancé you're harboring." "I'm not your fiancé," Faith said, finding her voice as she stood up. "I never agreed to marry you." "Your father agreed," Jenkins snapped. "That's good enough. We had a deal." Clay's stance shifted slightly, his hand resting near his holster. "A woman isn't a piece of property to be traded, Mr. Jenkins." "Says who? Some drifter with no stake in this territory." Jenkins scoffed. "I own half the water rights in this county. The O'Connors need my help to survive, and in exchange I get a young wife. It's a fair arrangement." "Not to her, it isn't," Clay replied. "And Faith is the only one whose opinion matters on who she marries." Luke, the younger of the brothers, looked uncomfortable. "Faith, please," Father's beside himself. "He says if you don't come home and honor this agreement, we'll lose everything." Faith felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overwhelmed by her determination not to be sacrificed for her family's financial security. "I'm sorry, Luke, I truly am, but I won't marry Mr. Jenkins." Jenkins' face darkened. "You ungrateful little—" He took a step toward the porch, but Clay moved smoothly into his path. "That's far enough," Clay said, his voice carrying a warning that made Jenkins pause. Matthew dismounted, his hand on his gun. "We're taking her home, mister. Don't make this uglier than it has to be." The tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Faith felt her heart racing, afraid of what would happen next. Then the boarding house door opened, and Mrs. Holloway emerged with a double-barreled shotgun cradled in her arms. "This is my property," she announced firmly, "and I don't recall inviting any of you gentlemen to visit. Miss O'Connor is under my roof by her own choice, and she'll stay as long as she pleases." Jenkins glared at the older woman. "You're interfering in a private matter, madam." "Nothing private about a man trying to buy himself a wife," Mrs. Holloway retorted. "Now, unless you have legitimate business in town, I suggest you move along before Sheriff Wilson takes an interest in this commotion." At the mention of the sheriff, Matthew hesitated, clearly reconsidering his options. Jenkins, however, was not so easily deterred. "This isn't over," he said, directing his words to Faith. "Your father signed papers. I have rights." "The only right any man has regarding marriage is to ask," Clay replied. "And a woman always has the right to refuse." For a tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might escalate further, but finally, Jenkins turned away, climbing awkwardly back onto his horse. "You'll regret crossing me," he warned, looking from Clay to Faith to Mrs. Holloway. "All of you." As the three men rode away, Faith felt her knees weaken with relief and residual fear. Clay turned to her, concern evident in his green eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Faith nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "They'll come back," she said. "Jenkins isn't a man who accepts being denied what he wants." "Then we'll be ready," Mrs. Holloway declared, setting her shotgun aside. "No one forces a woman into marriage in my town, not while I have breath in my body." Faith looked at the older woman with gratitude, then at Clay, who had once again placed himself in harm's way for her sake. Something warm unfurled in her chest, a feeling she wasn't yet ready to name. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for what these two relative strangers had done for her. Clay's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "No thanks needed, just doing what's right." But as their gazes held for a moment longer than necessary, Faith wondered if perhaps there was something more than simple decency motivating this quiet, steadfast man who had ridden into her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to make. Over the next few days, Faith settled into a routine at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, helping with chores and learning her way around Willow Creek. The dressmaker, Mrs. Finch, had indeed needed help and agreed to take Faith on as an assistant, starting the following Monday. Clay remained in town, ostensibly still pursuing leads on his stolen horse, but Faith noticed that he seemed to find reasons to be near the boarding house more often than not. They fell into the habit of sharing the evening meal, sometimes joined by Mrs. Holloway, sometimes alone on the porch as the desert sunset painted the sky in spectacular colors. During these quiet moments, Faith learned more about Clay: how he had lost his parents to cholera when he was 16, how he had worked his way up from stable boy to respected horse trainer, how he valued his freedom and the wide open spaces of the West. In turn, she shared her dreams with him, dreams of perhaps one day opening a small dressmaking shop of her own, of seeing more of the world beyond Arizona territory, of finding a life where she could make her own choices. "You remind me of a wild Mustang," Clay told her one evening as they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Strong-willed and meant to run free." Faith smiled at the comparison. "I'm not sure my father would consider that a compliment." "It's the highest compliment I know how to give," Clay replied seriously. "There's nothing more beautiful than a spirit that refuses to be broken." Their eyes met, and Faith felt something shift between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing since that first day on the road from her family's ranch. Clay reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently touched the fading bruise on her cheek. "No one will ever hurt you like that again," he promised, his voice low and intense. "Not while I draw breath." Faith leaned into his touch, her heart racing. "Why do you care so much what happens to me?" Clay seemed to consider his words carefully. "At first, it was just about doing what was right. But now—" He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Now I care because you're the most courageous woman I've ever met, Faith O'Connor, and because when I'm with you, I feel like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Faith's breath caught at the honesty in his words. Before she could respond, however, the sound of approaching riders shattered the moment. Clay was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his gun as he peered into the gathering darkness. "Get inside," he said urgently. "Now." Faith hesitated only briefly before hurrying into the boarding house, where she found Mrs. Holloway already reaching for her shotgun. "Trouble?" the older woman asked tersely. "I think so," Faith replied, her heart pounding as she peered through the window. 4 riders had pulled up in front of the boarding house. Jenkins, Faith's brothers, and her father. All were armed, and even from a distance, Faith could tell they had been drinking. Clay stood his ground on the porch, his stance relaxed but alert as Thomas O'Connor dismounted and approached. "We've come for my daughter," her father announced, his voice carrying clearly in the evening quiet. "I've indulged this foolishness long enough." "Your daughter is a grown woman making her own decisions," Clay replied evenly. "And she's decided she's not going with you." Jenkins spat on the ground. "That girl is promised to me. We had a deal, O'Connor. I expect you to deliver." Faith felt sick hearing herself discussed like livestock at auction. She turned to Mrs. Holloway. "I should go out there. This is my fight." "No," Mrs. Holloway said firmly. "That's exactly what they want. You stay put. Your cowboy can handle himself." Outside, the confrontation was escalating. "Step aside," Thomas O'Connor demanded, "or we'll move you." Clay didn't budge. 4 against 1 isn't very sporting, gentlemen." "Make that 4 against 2, came a new voice as Sheriff Wilson emerged from the shadows, his badge catching the last light of day. "Evening, gentlemen. Seems we have a situation brewing." Faith watched through the window as her father turned to face the sheriff, his expression thunderous. "This doesn't concern the law, Sheriff. It's a family matter. When armed men ride into my town after dark making threats, it becomes my concern," Sheriff Wilson replied mildly. "Now, why don't you all head over to the saloon and cool down or head back home?" "Miss O'Connor isn't going anywhere tonight." Jenkins pushed forward, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "This is outrageous. That girl belongs with her family, or with me as her husband. We have a contract." "A contract for marriage isn't worth the paper it's written on if the woman herself doesn't consent," the sheriff pointed out. "Now, I'm asking politely. Move along." For a tense moment, Faith feared violence would erupt. Her father's hand hovered near his gun, and Jenkins looked ready to charge the porch where Clay stood unmoving. Then, to her surprise, it was her brother Luke who broke the tension. "Come on, Pa," he said, putting a restraining hand on their father's arm. "Not like this." Faith wouldn't want to come home to a bloodbath anyway. Thomas O'Connor hesitated, then finally nodded curtly. "This isn't over," he warned, looking directly at Clay. "Not by a long shot." As the 4 men rode away, Faith sagged against the wall with relief. "Mrs. Holloway patted her shoulder before heading to the door to admit Clay and the sheriff. "Thank you, Sheriff," Faith said sincerely when the 2 men entered. Sheriff Wilson tipped his hat. "Just doing my job, Miss O'Connor. Though I should mention that your father did show me papers with his signature and Jenkins. Not legally binding without your consent, of course, but Jenkins seems to think otherwise. He paid my father for me, Faith said bitterly. 300 acres and enough money to save our ranch from the drought, the sheriff frowned. That puts things in a different light. Jenkins is a powerful man in these parts. He's not used to being denied. What are you saying, Sheriff? Clay asked sharply. I'm saying this situation could escalate, Sheriff Wilson replied. Jenkins won't let this go easily, and while I'll do what I can to keep the peace, my jurisdiction only extends to the town limits. After the sheriff left, Mrs. Holloway excused herself to prepare for bed, leaving Faith and Clay alone in the small parlor. I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to your door, Faith said quietly. Clay shook his head. You have nothing to apologize for. None of this is your fault. But it is, Faith insisted. My family is suffering because of my refusal. The ranch really will fail without Jenkins' help. That doesn't make it right for them to sell you like cattle, Clay replied, his voice gentle but firm. Your worth isn't measured in acres or dollars, Faith. Faith looked up at him, struck again by how different he was from any man she had ever known. What will happen now? They won't stop trying to take me back. Clay was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking, he finally said. My business in these parts is nearly concluded. I've accepted that my horse is likely long gone. I was planning to head back to Texas soon. Faith felt her heart sink at his words. The thought of Clay leaving was more painful than she had expected. I see, she managed to say. Well, I appreciate everything you've done. I'll be fine here with Mrs. Holloway and my new position at the dressmaker's. Faith, Clay said softly, taking her hands in his. I'm not suggesting leaving you behind. I'm asking if you might consider coming with me. Faith's eyes widened. To Texas. But why would you want that? Clay's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. Because in the short time I've known you, you've come to mean more to me than anyone has in a very long time. Because I can't bear the thought of riding away and never seeing you again. Are you asking me to marry you? Faith whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Clay smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Not exactly. Not yet. I'm asking you to come with me to Texas to see if what's growing between us might flourish away from the shadows of your past. I have a small ranch near San Antonio, nothing grand, but it's mine, free and clear. You could have your own cottage there, your independence, time to decide if. He paused, suddenly looking uncertain. If you might someday want more. Faith felt tears spring to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of his offer, not another demand for her hand, not another attempt to claim her, but an invitation to freedom and possibility. You would do that. Offer me a home with no strings attached, Clay nodded. Your choices have been taken from you for too long, Faith. I won't be another man who tries to control your destiny. Whatever grows between us should be your choice, freely made. Faith felt something warm and bright unfurl in her chest, a feeling of hope and possibility that had been foreign to her for so long. When would we leave? As soon as you're ready, Clay replied. The longer we stay, the more determined Jenkins and your family will become. Distance might be the best protection. Faith considered his words, knowing he was right. Willow Creek had offered temporary sanctuary, but Jenkins' influence stretched throughout the county. As long as she remained, there would be danger for her, for Clay, even for kind Mrs. Holloway. Yes, she decided, her voice growing stronger with certainty. I'll go with you to Texas. The relief and joy that crossed Clay's face made Faith's heart skip a beat. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss that held both promise and respect. When they parted, Faith knew that whatever the future held, she had made the right choice. For the first time in her life, she was following her own heart rather than bending to another's will. 2 days later, before dawn broke over the eastern horizon, Clay and Faith slipped quietly out of Willow Creek. Mrs. Holloway had tearfully bid them farewell the night before, pressing a small bundle of clothes and necessities into Faith's hands. "You write to me when you're settled," the older woman had insisted. "And if that young man doesn't treat you like the treasure you are, you come right back here, you hear?" Faith had hugged her tightly, grateful for the motherly affection she had been missing for so long. Now, as they rode double on Clay's borrowed mount, Faith felt a curious mixture of nervousness and exhilaration. Behind them lay everything she had ever known her family, flawed though they were, the land she had grown up on, the familiar rhythms of her old life. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. "Are you all right?" Clay asked softly as the first rays of sunlight began to color the sky. Faith nodded, leaning back slightly against his solid presence. "Yes, I'm scared, but I'm also free. I've never been free before." Clay's arm tightened around her waist. "We'll take it one day at a time. San Antonio is about 2 weeks' ride from here. We'll stop in El Paso to purchase supplies and a horse for you." The journey across the rugged terrain was challenging but exhilarating for Faith. Each night, they camped beneath the vast canopy of stars, talking for hours about their hopes and dreams, learning the contours of each other's souls. Clay was unfailingly respectful, always ensuring Faith had privacy and comfort as much as the trail would allow. In El Paso, Clay purchased a gentle mare for Faith and proper riding clothes to replace the borrowed dress she had been wearing. With 2 horses, they made better time eastward, crossing into Texas 5 days after leaving Willow Creek. As they traveled, Faith found herself falling more deeply in love with Clay Valance, with his quiet strength, his unwavering respect for her autonomy, his dry humor that emerged more frequently as they grew comfortable with each other. By the time they reached the outskirts of San Antonio, she knew with certainty that she had found not just a protector, but a partner. Clay's ranch was modest but beautiful, situated on a rolling piece of land with a creek running through it. A small main house, a stable, and a separate cottage stood in a rough semicircle, shaded by towering oak trees. "It's not much," Clay said as they rode up the path to the main house, "but it's peaceful." "It's perfect," Faith replied honestly, taking in the wildflowers that dotted the meadow beyond the house, the clear Texas sky overhead. As promised, Clay installed Faith in the cottage, giving her the space and independence he had promised. The small building had been his mother's weaving studio years ago, and though simple, it was cozy and private. In the weeks that followed, Faith bloomed like one of the wildflowers that surrounded the ranch. She learned to ride properly, to help with the horses Clay trained, to navigate the small town nearby where she quickly found work with the local dressmaker, just as she had planned in Willow Creek. And each evening, she and Clay would sit on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset and talking about their day. Sometimes they rode together on Sundays, exploring the surrounding countryside. Slowly, naturally, their relationship deepened, built on a foundation of mutual respect and growing affection. 3 months after their arrival in Texas, as they sat together on a blanket beside the creek, Clay turned to Faith with a serious expression. "I received a letter today," he said. "From Sheriff Wilson in Willow Creek." Faith tensed immediately. "What did it say?" "Jenkins passed away," Clay said simply. "Apparently he suffered an apoplexy after a confrontation with a business rival, and your father has sold what remained of your family's ranch. They've moved to California, according to the sheriff." Faith absorbed this news silently, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: relief that Jenkins no longer posed a threat, sadness for the loss of her family home, a strange sense of closure. "Are you all right?" Clay asked gently. Faith nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I am. It feels like the last ties to my old life have been severed, like I can truly begin anew." Clay took her hand, his expression solemn. "Faith O'Connor, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I promised when we left Arizona that I wouldn't pressure you, that you would have time to decide your own path." Faith felt her heart begin to race as Clay continued. "I love you," he said simply. "I love your courage, your kindness, your determination to forge your own way. I love the way you laugh, the way you talk to the horses, the way you see beauty in everything around you." He paused, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small silver ring. "I'm not asking you to give up your independence or your dreams. I'm asking if you might consider building a life with me, as my wife, my partner in all things." Tears welled in Faith's eyes as she looked at the earnest expression on Clay's face. This was no business arrangement, no transaction between men where she was merely the commodity being exchanged. This was an invitation offered with love and respect, one she was completely free to accept or decline. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed through her tears. "Yes, Clay Valance, I will marry you." As Clay slipped the ring onto her finger, his mother's ring, he told her later Faith marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young woman with no choices, beaten for daring to say no, to a woman freely choosing the path of her heart. "I love you," she said, the words feeling like freedom on her tongue. "I think I've loved you since that day you rode between me and my family and offered me a choice no one else had ever given me." Clay pulled her gently into his arms, his kiss a promise of all the years to come, years of partnership, of respect, of love freely given and received. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Faith O'Connor became Faith Valance in a simple ceremony beside the creek that ran through their property. Mrs. Holloway traveled all the way from Arizona to attend, beaming with pride as she watched the young woman she had sheltered pledge her life to the man who had rescued her. As the years passed, the Valance Ranch prospered. Clay's reputation as a horse trainer grew, bringing clients from across Texas to their door. Faith opened a small dressmaking shop in town, fulfilling her dream of independence even as she built a life with the man she loved. Their first child, a daughter, arrived 2 years after their wedding, followed by twin boys 3 years later. Faith raised her children with gentle guidance rather than harsh demands, teaching them that their voices and choices mattered. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play beneath the oak trees, Clay took Faith's hand, running his thumb over the silver ring that had never left her finger. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, "with the life we've built?" Faith leaned her head against his shoulder, thinking of all they had shared, the joys and challenges, the growth of their ranch, the family they had created together. "More than happy," she replied. "I'm free and loved. That's more than I ever dared to dream." As the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Faith thought back to that fateful day when a stranger had ridden between her and harm, offering her a choice that had changed everything. In choosing to leave with Clay Valance, she had not only found safety, she had found herself, her strength, her voice. And in that voice, strong and clear with certainty, she whispered, "I wouldn't change a single moment that led us here."